Introducing Meta Ray-Ban Display, the world's most advanced AI glasses. With a full color display built into the lens of the glasses, it's there when you need it and gone when you don't. Send and receive messages, translate or caption live conversations, collaborate with Meta AI, and more. Be one of the first to try Meta Ray-Ban Display. Visit meta.com/Meta Ray-Ban Display to book a demo and find your pair.
Say hello to the all-new Alexa Plus and see how Alexa can do so much more for you. Need tickets to see your favorite artist? Craving your comfort restaurant? Just sit back, relax, and talk naturally. Alexa's on it. It learns your style, anticipates what's next, and makes it happen across Echo, Fire TV, and more. Learn more at amazon.com/new Alexa.
The Lincoln Wishlist sales event is happening now. Here's what's on everyone's wish list. Enjoying holiday jingles with brilliant 3D audio that surrounds you? Check. Watching snow flurries through the panoramic Vista roof? Check. Packing up presents with the spacious Lincoln Splitgate? Check. Everything you want. All standard on the 2025 Lincoln Navigator SUV. Visit your local Lincoln retailer or learn more at Lincoln.com for exceptional offers on 2025 Lincoln vehicles today.
After the kidnapping of the two Michaels and years of discussion about foreign interference, I would have thought that Canadian elected officials were, well, kind of put off on the idea of cozying up to China. Beijing is not the answer to our troubles with Washington, but the Carney government is at least paying lip service to that. Hello and welcome to the Full Comment Podcast. My name's Brian Lilly, your host. And this week, we're going to take another look at China, especially through the eyes of Charles Burton. He's a former Canadian diplomat who served in Beijing twice during the 1990s, the beginning of the decade and the end. He's an academic who's long written about this issue, and he has a new book out called The Beaver and the Dragon: How China Out-Manoeuvred Canada's Diplomacy, Security, and Sovereignty. Charles, thanks for the time.
It's good to speak with you, Brian.
Yeah, it's been a while, but I'm not sure that the issues of China that you and I have talked about in the past have really changed all that much. We appear to have slipped back into our naive sense that, well, we're Canada. We can deal with Beijing. Everything's going to be fine. What would you say to what you've seen from the Carney government over the last little while in terms of saying we can pivot towards China while we're having trouble with Washington?
Well, I mean, certainly I think that the Carney government wants to give the impression that they're working hard to diversify our trade away from the United States to salvage prosperity and through international relations and save factories and save jobs and so on. It's not going to happen with China. And the cost that the Chinese are extracting is for a promise to provide us more access to the Chinese market of a rather diffuse nature. Our government is basically following everything that China wants in its geostrategic reach into Canada. I mean, I was quite shocked when I heard the comments of the Canadian Deputy Foreign Minister, David Morrison, at a reception to mark the Chinese National Day. It happened, Chinese National Day is October the 1st. This happened September 26th. And the Chinese ambassador made a speech where he essentially said, Canada is going to correct its ways and that Canada will adopt a pragmatic and constructive approach to China, which is what they want, and that we should set aside differences and seek common ground. Well, then the deputy foreign minister quoted the Chinese language of pragmatic and constructive and said how much the prime minister would agree to the ambassador's warm words. Well, when the Chinese say pragmatic and constructive and set aside differences and focus on commonalities, what they mean is that we will cease to criticize Chinese regime behavior in any way, and that would include Chinese influence operations, Chinese stealing of dual-use military technologies, restricting Chinese access to the north, and so on.
Just to interrupt a second, Charles. What they really mean is not, don't criticize us on human rights, which they never want, and which Canadian governments really just have always paid lip service to. They're saying, don't complain that we're stealing from you. on your industrial base, that we're spying on you, that we're trying to influence your election. Don't talk about the things that we're doing in your country that are upsetting you.
Right. And I think it's basically giving them a buy that says we will never expel any of your diplomats who are involved in influence operations, bribery, coordinating espionage. I mean, we only expelled the one guy, Zhao Wei, when the Globe and Mail revealed that this man had been attempting to prepare to harass the family of the conservative foreign affairs critic Michael Chong. But CSIS knows that there are a lot of these people in our country. There has been evidence given in Parliament that the enormous Chinese diplomatic cohort in Canada is 70% people who are not involved in legitimate diplomatic function. Why do we tolerate that? And then we have the Prime Minister responding to Xi Jinping when they met briefly in Korea, using the same language. Xi Jinping said pragmatic and constructive, and our PM repeated it twice, and said even more disturbingly that we would look at a dialogue to help build a more sustainable and inclusive international system. And that's, again, Chinese code words for their plan to become the dominant power on the planet, what they call the community of the common destiny of mankind. And our Prime Minister is using language which suggests that Canada will support this. It just completely blows my mind about how captured our people seem to have been. They don't seem to have much corporate memory about how badly things can go with China, and how the Chinese infiltration of our society, the co-opting of our elites and so on, is a successive process. So,
Should we be shocked at David Morrison, though? Just to go back to the deputy minister who you started this story with. He figured prominently in the foreign interference inquiry, headed up by Justice Hogue. He was at one point the national security advisor who apparently missed all this, or missed it, or looked the other way.
Well, I think it is a question of, we know from the Ogg inquiry and from the leaks to the Globe and Mail and to Global News and Sam Cooper that our security agencies have been expressing a lot of concern about activities of Chinese Communist Party, United Front Work Department, and Ministry of State Security operations. And Minister Blair lost the warrant to have surveillance of a prominent Ontario cabinet minister, former Ontario cabinet minister. Other ones, the Prime Minister said, well, we received it from CSIS, but we don't really think that it's true, and so we didn't act on it. Or the case where the CSIS was asked to revise a report. I mean, if the Prime Minister feels that all these warnings from CSIS are not valid, then why doesn't he fire the head of CSIS and get in people that will give him information that he can rely on? So it is pretty bad, actually, and getting worse. And it seems that under the Carney government, we're going back to a complete blindness on anything that China's doing that doesn't impact on our ability or our hope to gain more share of the Chinese market and remove the tariffs on canola seeds and allow Chinese investment in Canada and all of these things that would build our prosperity that the Chinese constantly promise us that they historically have never fulfilled.
There's an old saying that only Nixon could go to China. And of course, liberals have long loved to say to me, yes, but Trudeau went first. Meaning Pierre Trudeau. Would you say that Canada's bumpy ride, bumpy journey, naive interactions with China go back to Pierre Trudeau's time in office? I mean, he clearly was an admirer of the country. He had toured it when Westerners could not. Is that what started the sense that Canada could be a player with China, that Canada and China would have a different relationship, the naive sentiment that is at the basis of this relationship?
I think that is true. I mean, certainly at the end of his prime ministership, Mr. Trudeau hosted the General Secretary of the Chinese Communist Party, Zhao Ziyang, to give a joint address to Parliament. And in that, Mr. Trudeau waxed nostalgic about how he talked with Premier Zhou Enlai on his 1970s trip to China about global affairs until late in the night. So Mr. Trudeau admired Chairman Mao and Zhou Enlai, even though this was the Cultural Revolution, when any notion that China was anyway compliant with anything like his Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms was simply not true. And his earlier trip with Senator Jacques Hébert was in the middle of the Great Leap Forward famine, which was caused by Chairman Mao's communization of the countryside and insistence that that farmers melt steel by melting down iron implements. But, it was a tragic event where up to 40 million people died out of a population of 700 million at the time because of bad government policy. And Mr. Trudeau and Senator Hébert, in their book, Two Innocents in China, which was re-released in English after Mr. Trudeau became Prime Minister in 1968, seems to not to have noticed that there was an ongoing massive famine, government caused, going on in the country. So, it certainly, I don't think we can say that Mr. Trudeau did this personally, but there were a lot of people at the time who thought that the Chinese Communist Revolution was a superior way and a model for third world countries that wouldn't be beholden to the Soviet Union and to the Americans. So in a way, I think Trudeau was trying to stick it to Nixon, and then Nixon shortly thereafter sent Kissinger to establish relations with China based on the idea that China and America could get together to counter Russia. So yes, I mean, it is a Trudeau thing, and certainly Justin Trudeau was well aware of this tradition, and I think felt that he could carry on his father's legacy with China. It's been a disaster for Canada. We're probably the most infiltrated of the Western countries by the Chinese regime, simply because we don't take any action against espionage, influence operations. We don't address China's support for third world dictatorships through transfer of surveillance technologies. And of course, we don't build our defense against potential Chinese incursions, particularly in the Arctic, where China defines itself as a near Arctic state. Although if you look at the map of the world, they're about
They're
as near
nowhere
as
near.
Yemen. Yeah.
I want to get to that in a bit because of the interesting story that I've related before about comments from the Chinese regime around the time that Hu Jintao visited Canada in 2010. Well, that's when Stephen Harper was Prime Minister, and Stephen Harper tried to take a different view. He tried to take, at the beginning, a tougher approach with China. But the business community in this country revolted at that. He tried to say, look, China is a human rights abuser. China is involved in industrial and industrial espionage, among others, that this is a problem and we have to face it. And they need to give back Canadians that they're holding, such as Mr. Salil. The business community freaked out and browbeat him effectively into changing his tune. I know you write extensively in the book about Mr. Harper. Would you agree with that sentiment, that he changed over time from one view to another and then finally probably a third?
Well, always within Canadian cabinets, you have a split between those who are beholden to business elements that have extensive lucrative dealings with Chinese communist business networks, and those who are more concerned about security and, in fact, human rights issues. So, within the Harper cabinet, you had Jason Kenney, who I think was consistently standing on the right side in terms of concern about the malign influence of the Chinese regime. Mr. Kenney appeared at my book launch in Ottawa last week and gave a very nice speech. I'm grateful to him for having tried his best to keep things on the rails. He failed. Maybe it was like a split between the Mulroney element in the Conservative Party and the Reform element, where the Mulroney people are involved with Quebec businesses, at the time, Bombardier, SNC-Lavalin, and so on, had quite a lot of investment in China and naturally had a lot of influence in the prime minister's office over decisions relating to trade because they built a lot of prosperity in Canada.
You actually titled one of your chapters, "Why Did Harper Go to China? The Ethnic Vote and Money," kind of a paraphrase of Jacques Parizeau. But there's a huge amount of influence, especially in the Montreal business community, more so than I would say here in Toronto, although it's significant here. But there's a huge influence in the Montreal business community with China.
Yeah, I think that that's historically been the case. Bombardier has done awful lot of business in that country. And now under Carney, we seem to be returning to that kind of mentality. A couple of years ago, we put together the Indo-Pacific policy, and there was an extraordinary section where, really quite good, where they defined China as a disruptive power in global affairs. I didn't like disruptive power. I want a strategic competitor. But when Hu Jintao was in Canada back in the mid 2005, we came up with this strategic partnership agreement. And now under Carney and Foreign Minister Anand, we've gone back to strategic partnership. I mean, what sort of insanity is this? How can we possibly be a partner with a country that is so actively hostile to pretty much everything that Canada believes in economically and in terms of the world community?
Well,
So,
we seem to
it is.
forget that they kidnapped two of our people as hostage diplomacy, that they destroyed one of the bedrocks of every Canadian pension plan in Nortel,
Yep.
and that they continue to interfere in our elections. We seem to have just said, "Oh yeah, well that was before, but it's different now."
Yeah, I think that is the case, and certainly Michael Kovrig has been writing really very powerful pieces on this exact thing about how naive and it's sort of a combination of naivete, where the polls are showing that more and more Canadians are feeling more favorable to closer engagement with China, and greed, which is really about the businesses get some short-term benefits from China, and then our security and sovereignty continues to fall further and further into a Chinese trap. So it. I'm despairing about how it's going to be over the next few years, especially if Mr. Carney gets a majority in the spring and goes holus bolus for allowing China to get a buy on all of the non-trade aspects of the relationship. Will we allow China to engage in mining operations? Will we revive the free trade agreement that Mr. Trudeau bungled back in 2017? And the Asia Pacific Foundation even suggests that we might enter the Chinese Belt and Road Initiative, which is really involved in restructuring the global economy towards China at the center. They'd
You think we
certainly.
could go that far as joining Belt and Road?
Well, not if I have anything to say about it or you, but,
I mean, we
if
we
things,
were part of the Asian Infrastructure Bank.
we still are. I mean, we suspended, we didn't leave it. And, as you'll read in the book, I think I certainly oppose that because that really was an agency designed to fund the Belt and Road. In other words, and as we found out subsequently, we put a lot of money, I think, pushing up to $1 billion in the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, or a
And
commitment to
so
that, and never got anything back for it. They never bought any Canadian stuff.
help people understand, who maybe aren't obsessed the way you and I are, but will want to, hear what you're saying and then, go and read your book.
Yeah.
So the Asian Infrastructure Bank, as you say, was used to fund Belt and Road. So the Asian Infrastructure Bank, controlled by Beijing, other countries were putting money into it. And then what was that money used for? Explain a little bit what Belt and Road is all about.
The Belt and Road Initiative is a project designed to build infrastructure and port facilities throughout the world to really facilitate the transfer of natural resources into China. So you've got the belts and the roads. The belts are the sea transportation routes facilitated by China, and the roads are land transportation going all the way to Europe. So China's invested a lot in third world countries in port facilities and upgrading facilities to get minerals to tidewater, which then go to China. It's
Not due to benevolence.
Well, they say it's benevolent, and they're inclined to, build new palaces for dictators and sports stadiums and that kind of thing. But it really is about getting stuff out to China. And I've noticed in some of my work that the countries that China provides the most loan forgiveness to, because the loans are given in ways where the money is not monitored as closely as the World Bank or the Japanese Asian Development Bank, and a lot of it seems to end up in Swiss bank accounts, leaving the nations holding the bag for some poor infrastructure projects that don't produce the anticipated returns. But what you're looking at is countries that have desirable port facilities seem to get more Chinese investment, and you can't help but think that that's really with a view in future to China setting up blue water naval facilities and submarines in these critical parts of the world as part of its overall the Community of the Common Destiny of Mankind program, which, debases international institutions like the UN and WTO in favor of ones based on China as the dominant superpower. And the other
this is
aspect
what
is,
the British did over years. It's what the Americans did.
well, I think that's what the Africans are thinking, maybe the Chinese will be better. But in fact, the Chinese have a much more long-term systematic plan for global domination, which you can read about pretty clearly if you read Chinese in particular, that's what the regime is trying to sell to its people. I don't think they'll succeed because the Chinese economy is not going well, and the Xi regime is not being successful in terms of serving the people's needs. And people in China feel uncertain about the future, and so they're not spending, and they're suffering from deflation and so on. But with the Belt and Road, by providing these generous loans, China, in some cases, seems to anticipate the loans will fail, and then in compensation demands like a 99-year lease on a port. They've done that in a couple of places. So they're able to use a kind of loan leverage to gain Chinese advantage in militarily geostrategic areas. I mean, in the Chinese regime, you cannot separate Chinese business from the Chinese Communist Party, the military, and the state. They're all working in very sophisticated coordination to achieve overall Chinese goals, and we just can't match it. Sometimes I think I should go over to the dark side and work for the Chinese because they seem to be getting further in things, but unfortunately, my Canadian values hold me back. I just can't stomach the idea. Certainly, they'd like me to. They have offered me opportunities to make a lot of money, which I have so far turned down.
We have to take a quick break. When we come back, though, I do want to ask you about the military and their vision of themselves as an Arctic nation or near Arctic nation, but before that, I'll get quick comments from you on canola tariffs and EVs. More in moments.
John Legend, Sheryl Crow, Elvis Costello, and Alanis Morissette star in the MGM Plus original series, Words and Music. Iconic artists share intimate performances and the stories behind the songs. New episodes Sundays on MGM Plus.
This episode is brought to you by Ulta Beauty. Holiday cheer is here, and Ulta Beauty has gifts for everyone on your list. Treat them to fan-favorite gift sets from Charlotte Tilbury and Peach & Lily. Go all out with timeless fragrances from YSL, Ariana Grande, and Carolina Herrera. And you can never go wrong with an Ulta Beauty gift card. Head to Ulta Beauty for gifts that make the holidays brighter and even more beautiful. Ulta Beauty. Gifting happens here.
This is Jason Momoa, and I'll be your finance professor today. Welcome to Banking Smarter 101 with Chime. Bam! First lesson, sign up for Chime and set up direct deposit. You'll be joining millions of members banking fee-free. Second lesson, get cash back on eligible purchases while building credit and a higher APY on your savings. That's how you bank smarter this season. Fa la 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 la, class dismissed. Join Chime today.
Chime is a financial technology company, not a bank. Banking services and a secure Chime Visa credit card provided by the Bancorp Bank N.A. or Stride Bank N.A. Members FDIC. Optional services and products may have fees or charges. Details at chime.com/fees-info. With a qualifying direct deposit, earn 1.5% cash back on eligible secure Chime Visa credit card purchases. On-time payment history may have a positive impact on your credit score. Results may vary. APY means annual percentage yield. Learn about credit building and more at chime.com.
This is Tristan Harper, the host of Canada Did What?, where we unpack the biggest, weirdest, and wildest political moments in Canadian history you thought you knew and tell you what really happened. Stick around at the end of the episode to hear a sample of one of our favorite episodes. If you don't want to stick around, make sure you subscribe to Canada Did What? Everywhere you get podcasts.
So, Charles, the Beaver and the Dragon is really a collection of essays. It's not, one big tome that goes through, but you've collected all these essays and you talk about different things. And at one point, you're writing that trade with China is never free. Interesting, similar to the title of a book I have behind me from Robert Lighthizer, No Trade is Free. So that applies around the world. But, right now, China has slapped canola tariffs on Canadian products, as they did in 2013, 14, and 2017 and 2020. They had a ban for 2 years. They really like hitting on canola. Also pork and seafood, also facing tariffs. And now they're saying, but, if you just get rid of your tariffs on our electric vehicles that we're dumping into your market at half the price it costs to make them, and you allow us to spy on you using these cars, we will lift the canola tariffs. Is that a good deal?
Well, I oppose it. I mean, it used to be that when they complained about when they tried to use economic leverage by restricting access of our commodities to the market, they'd come up with some fake reason. I mean, when they imposed the ban on Canadian canola in response to Canada's detention of the Huawei CFO Meng Wanzhou in response to a U.S. extradition request, they said, "Oh, your canola has musks and stuff in the non-seed portion." I mean, it was complete and utter nonsense. I mean, none of our other other customers for canola had any complaints about contamination. This time, they don't bother with that, and they've got to the point where they're strong enough that they can just arbitrarily decide to violate the norms of international trade, and they will. But I spoke at the parliamentary committee that was considering the 100% tariff on EVs, and there were a lot of unions and auto companies. Everybody there was supporting the tariff idea. My support for the tariff idea was because of what you said, which is they're basically spy machines on wheels. They're worse than Huawei 5G in terms of their threat to us, and because they are subject to control from China. So software update could be put in that would allow the Chinese to cripple the EVs if there was a conflict over Taiwan or South China Sea or whatever. And there's also the American notion, which is that if Canadians bought Chinese EVs, the Americans would not let Canadians drive them into the United States. So, if you want to get to your condo in Florida, don't take your EV. You'll have to fly or get a gas car. So, I mean, clearly the EVs are so subsidized by the Chinese state that those unions and auto manufacturers are right, that they would devastate our own auto market. But the reason
one of the complaints that I do hear from farmers, and that includes family members who are growing canola, is that, there really isn't an EV industry in Canada, but China's not interested in eliminating the EV industry in Canada. They want to eliminate the auto industry in Canada, is my view. Am I taking it too far?
Well, I mean, China and the U.S. both would like to see no manufacture of autos in southern Ontario, which is a pretty big hit for the Canadian economy. I mean, Mr. Trump wants to relocate the factories to the United States, and China would like to, as you say, completely dominate our auto sector, which would again give them enormous leverage over Canada in non-trade areas. But, the reason that the EVs are so cheap is the same reason that Huawei 5G technology was undercutting Samsung and Ericsson by 30%, because the Chinese factor in the benefit to their geostrategic interests and espionage by subsidizing both Huawei and the EV industry enormously. So, I can see what's happening here, but on the one hand, you've got the canola farmers who 40,000 of them and associated numbers of people that rely on canola farmers for consumption in their own businesses, who are devastated by this action. And of course, lots of Canadians who would love to have a cheap, wonderful Chinese EV. Apparently, the battery technology is better, and they're selling for something ridiculously small, like $8,000 in Brazil for the cheapest one. So maybe not 8,000, but not very much compared to our auto costs. So it's again the Chinese able to use economic leverage to overcome our concerns over our security and sovereignty. And I don't think we ought to give in, but my guess is we will.
My advice to those in the canola industry is that, look, they are a bad partner, and every time there is any kind of disagreement with China, they're going to hit you. They banned you for 2 years. Find other markets, be it in India, Mexico, South Korea. Find other markets, because these guys, take the profit when you can, but they're unreliable and they'll hit you again. The
It's a
idea that we
global
can
commodity. There will be other markets elsewhere. And of course, our canola farmers already cycle barley and wheat with canola. I mean, canola is a higher value crop, but it's not like the fields have to lie fallow. We've just got to adjust. But I do think that the government ought to be much more aware of the concerns of our Saskatchewan and Alberta canola farmers, and the government is not. In other words, there's quite a different attitude towards helping out the Southern Ontario auto industry among the Laurentian elite than honest, hardworking farmers in the prairies who have been, as you say, suffering from this political problems with their crop, which seems to be even worse than climate, drought, and floods. So government should be paying more attention to those concerns, and they're not. And naturally, there's a move for independence if Central Canada just pretends that there isn't a problem here that they need to address.
total two-way trade with China is under $120 billion a year. Most of that is China sending us stuff. Tinkers, manufactured products, a lot of plastics. We send raw materials. Is it even plausible that we can pivot towards China, the way that Mark Carney has been hinting at, to replace American markets?
No, I mean, it's ridiculous. I mean, China will not start accepting a large amount of Canadian imports when their own economy is doing so badly. I mean, it's just I don't know what feasibility study they've done on this, but it's not happening. And I mean, there are things that we should be doing. We should be trying to challenge the Chinese near monopoly on critical minerals. We should be not shipping the stuff to China for processing, but we ought to be doing the investment in getting identifying where these rare earths are and processing them, building the factories to process them in Canada. And certainly if we did that, that would strengthen our hand considerably with the nations that are involved in manufacture of high-tech goods in Eastern Asia, and give us some basis to really get more access to the markets there by making a commitment to help them diversify away from a frightening dependence on China for these elements which are so increasingly important as our high-tech AI and so on moves from strength to strength.
It would give us tremendous leverage with the Americans as well. They would be over the moon.
Well, I mean, the Americans ought to realize that, it's all very well that you've got lot more population, but when it comes down to natural resources and water, electricity and so on, they need us. Probably a lot more than they appreciate. I mean, Mr. Trump says we don't need Canada. On that point, he's wrong.
The view of the Carney government, though, is that we can go get a win-win deal here. And that's not something that you believe is feasible with China. I wonder whether it's feasible with Donald Trump at the moment. Generally speaking, I would say with the Americans, yes, but Trump is a tough negotiator who's got very, you know, firm ideas on what he wants. But the Chinese don't even think in those terms, do they?
No, I mean, the idea that we can come up with, strategic partnership with two nations that pose an existential threat to Canada's way of life and democracy, which is the United States that wants us to be the 51st state and then move on to Greenland, and China, which wants to turn Canada into a subordinate supplier of raw materials to feed China's global domination. We really need to be looking at countries that don't pose an existential threat to Canada and strengthening our relations with the Trans-Pacific Partnership and like-minded nations in Europe, and particularly northern nations, with regard to trying to strengthen our ability to defend the Arctic from Russia and Chinese claims that the parts of the Arctic that should be under Canadian sovereign control, in fact, are international and can be exploited by Russia and China. I'm waiting for Canada to agree to China to be involved in Arctic development and port facilities and so on, which really would be game over in terms of our notion that Canada is the true North, strong and free.
Do you mean having China come in to somewhere like Grays Bay Port and say, we'll help you develop this, we'll invest in this?
Well, it was like the money losing gold mine a few years ago up there, where turns out it was spitting distance from a NORAD installation and had an outlet into the Arctic Sea. China is so blatant about what they're going to do in this regard, because they feel so confident now that they can basically tell Canada to shove it. I mean, the interaction between Xi Jinping and Carney was quite different from what we saw when the Chinese were treating Pierre Trudeau so kindly and sending senior leaders to accompany him on tours of the Yangtze River. Mr. Xi was basically looking at Mr. Carney as a subordinate and admonishing him as a school child that was behaving out of turn. So it's from the Chinese point of view, their relations with Canada are very different from the way they were before. And Mr. Carney seems to be giving into this by, echoing their kind of language for the way the relationship should be: pragmatic, constructive, set aside differences and seek common ground. All this stuff is Chinese language, not Canadian language.
In terms of the Arctic, I mentioned earlier about Hu Jintao when he was the top leader on the Chinese side, Chinese president. And he came to visit Stephen Harper in 2010. Just before he arrived, one of my colleagues noted an interview that a top Chinese general had given, talking about how, China is a near Arctic nation, and we are 20% of the world's population, therefore we deserve 20% of the resources under the Arctic. They have a very different view of what to do in the Arctic. One, I think they want to control parts of it, and they have more vessels up there than we do.
Yes.
But two, I think they would also drill baby drill if they could, or mine, or any resource that's up there, they would exploit it. Is that a major concern for us, and does it tie into the American concern that we're not serious about Arctic sovereignty and looking after our, as Steve Bannon put it to me, our soft underbelly?
Well, I mean, absolutely. And, we have, over past years, allowed the Chinese to engage in so-called scientific expeditions up in the Arctic. I think that the word is that China's been doing more mapping of Arctic waters than Canada has, and we've been finding espionage buoys that have been dropped close to our shores, which the Chinese have set out in the course of these activities. So, I mean, their interest in gaining benefit from the Arctic is pretty transparent, and I think the idea that they would offer to Canada that they would assist us in Arctic development is also there, particularly if this appalling idea that Canada joins the Belt and Road Initiative leads to China saying, "Oh yeah, well we'll do investment up there. You don't have the resources we do. We can help you make the most of Arctic ports and resource development in that part of the world." And they also deal directly with the Inuit and other indigenous peoples up there, often claiming that you're really Chinese. You have cultural similarities to us, and that we will provide you with the economic benefits that the Canadian government is not. Well, I mean, that sort of stuff is, we shouldn't be allowing that to happen.
What should we be doing then to protect Canada's sovereignty in the Arctic? Because China clearly has plans and designs. So what should we do, whether it's at the political level or the military level?
Well, I think, the military level, we need to be making massive investment in being able to defend our country. I mean, what country in the world cannot defend its borders? That would be Canada. And I guess it's a matter of making decisions that prioritize the defense of Canada from foreigners, and particularly up in the north, it's about Russia and China. What I think politically is we have to stop tolerating what China's doing. And so if China has a diplomatic cohort where most of them are not involved in their legitimate diplomatic function, we should be sending those people back. We shouldn't allow the Chinese to have a lot more agents in our country than we're allowed diplomats in their country.
Can you elaborate on that? I know it's something I've talked to you and others about in the past, but the sheer size of the Chinese diplomatic corps in Canada far outstrips our relations.
Yeah, I mean, I was in Parliament last week, and Conservative Party gave a statistic of 176 Chinese diplomats in Canada, and that's pushing up to the number that the Americans have, compared to 40-some for the Japanese, 30-some for the Indians. There's no justification for having that many people here. And when we accept a diplomat, the country that's sending a diplomat has to tell us what they'll be doing. And so, are Chinese diplomats so much less efficient than those of other nations that they need 4 times the number than the country really justifies? And that doesn't include their immigration program, which they've subcontracted to private sources. So when you want a Chinese visa, you're not going to the embassy or consulate, you're going to a facility off-site. And not to speak of this problem of the police stations. And the diplomats in question are affiliated with the Chinese State Ministry of State Security or its associated institution, which is the Chinese Communist Party's United Front Work Department. And so when you have a situation where you hear in the Ogg Commission, for example, that Chinese people were induced to vote for candidates that China felt would favor China's interests, and were providing red envelopes to donors of Chinese origin to compensate for the part of their donation which would not be able to be written off their tax. This is done by proxies off-site in those so-called police stations, which are really, non-official Chinese consular facilities. Like when you want to pick up your money for making the donation to compensate for the part of it that was not able to be tax deductible, you're not going to knock on the door of the Chinese consulate. It's going to be done through an association friendly to China that has operations off-site. So I don't understand why we tolerate this. I assume that CSIS knows about what's going on, but maybe at the political center it's felt, we don't want to cause trouble with the Chinese and interfere with our trade relations, so we'll just let it go. It's a very foolish and short-sighted approach. But then I think we have to have concern about Canadian policymakers and politicians who are beholden to China, even in the notion that maybe if you don't do anything that China wouldn't like while you're in a position of public trust, after you leave politics, in your mid-50s, you can make big money working for law firms or Chinese firms on boards, which reward you for having been a friend of China when you had a civil service or or political position. And let's remember the UNSICOP report that suggested, I think there were 11 members of parliament that were seen as wittingly or unwittingly under the influence of a foreign power, and a larger number of staffers in the same situation.
Mhm.
And we're aware of this kind of thing going on in Britain and the United States, and people being arrested and expelled, but nobody seems to be called to task for this in Canada. And we never found out who those 13 members of parliament were, and presumably they ran again for parliament and could well be serving in parliament now.
It's frustrating, and I remember several years ago talking to Michelle Juno-Katsuya, former CSIS agent, about Operation Sidewinder and the Sidewinder report, which detailed the infiltration of China back in the 1990s and going back into the 1980s and how it was done. And that was leaked out and never really resulted in any change. And I thought, well, when we get a public inquiry into Chinese election interference, surely this is going to change something. I don't think it's changed a thing.
I mean, certainly that report was the beginning, and now we see how it's developed and developed over those years since 98. And let's bear in mind, I mean, what has actually happened as a result of the AUG inquiry? Anything different? Don't see it. And then we had Bill C-70, which called for a Foreign Influence Transparency Commissioner and a Foreign Influence Transparency Registry that would require people who have a conflict of interest because they're receiving benefits from a foreign state to declare that publicly. That legislation was passed through Parliament in June 2024, and there's no sign of the commissioner or the registry, and no sign that it'll be coming up anytime soon, despite assurances from the government that it would happen a year after the legislation went through, and then they said it would happen in September, and then they said it would happen before the end of the year. Now they're talking about maybe sometime next spring. The government has to have an ordering council appointment of a commissioner. How hard is that? When we needed a fentanyl commissioner, they were able to do it lickety-split. But when it comes to somebody who might reveal that there are Canadians, respected Canadians who have served in government in the past, who are receiving benefits from China, it seems that the government is not prepared to act with very much speed.
His book is The Beaver and the Dragon, How China Outmaneuvered Canada's Diplomacy, Security, and Sovereignty. Do check it out. Collection of essays, an easy read. Charles Burton, thanks so much as always.
It's great to speak with you.
Full Comment is a post-media podcast. My name's Brian Lilly, your host. This episode was produced by Andre Proulx, theme music by Bryce Hall. Kevin Libin is the executive producer. Make sure that you hit subscribe, leave us a review, tell your friends and neighbors about us. Thanks for listening. Until next time, I'm Brian Lilly.
Here's that clip from Canada Did What? I Promised You. Castro would end up occupying a space in the Trudeau family similar to that of a beloved uncle. They went diving. They smoked cigars together. They gathered sea urchins for beach cookouts.
Informal talks at an island hideaway intensified their respect for each other, and their mutual enjoyment of skin diving added to the rapport.
In addition to a well-publicized 1976 summit meeting, Trudeau took 3 separate vacations to visit Castro after his time in politics had ended.
I can make, just one reference to Pierre Trudeau's sons to show the closeness of the relationship. The nickname that the Trudeau sons had for Fidel Castro was Papa Fidel. So that gives you an indication of the closeness of the bond that existed between a communist dictator, thorn in the side of every American administration for the past 50 years, and Pierre Trudeau.
When Trudeau's youngest son, Michel, died in an avalanche in 1998, Castro called the family in tears to express his condolences. As an 8-year-old, Michel had referred to Fidel Castro as his best friend. When Pierre died, Fidel declared 3 days of mourning in Cuba and flew to Montreal to act as an honorary pallbearer.
Every time Trudeau went down to Cuba, all the people in South Florida, the exiles, were thinking, why is this Western leader giving comfort to a murderous dictator, who is oppressing their people in Cuba, and saying, good things about Fidel Castro. And as I've mentioned, to have him in the pew at Trudeau's funeral, in the front row, as a dignified person, when he had been such a brutal leader, says more about Pierre Trudeau than it does about Fidel Castro.
Here's where we should probably touch on what Castro had done and what he was continuing to do while going on beach vacations with the Trudeau family.
If you want to hear the rest of the story, make sure you subscribe to Canada Did What everywhere you get your podcasts.